What's up, everybody? Welcome to another online lecture with Mr. Regas. Today, we're going to be talking about peacekeeping and peacemaking. You're probably familiar with these terms, or at least peacekeeping. You also probably recognize the blue helmet that we see in this photo here. Now, the two letters on it, UN, obviously standing for United Nations. The blue helmet's the symbol of peacekeeping. And I'd say it's probably one of the better known symbols across the planet. So we're going to look at the difference between the two. We're going to focus mostly on peacekeeping. We're going to look at what is it? What are some of the different types of peacekeeping? Does it work? How does it work? It's kind of a complicated thing. There's also a lot of, I think, negative feelings towards peacekeeping, at least in more recent years, because there has been some very high profile failures of it. So we're going to look at these different aspects. So let's get started. So what is peacekeeping, first of all? Well, it began in 1948 to observe and maintain the ceasefire during the Arab-Israeli War. We see Canadian diplomat and future Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, that's the guy in the picture here. It was kind of his idea. He's one of the people who came up with some of the important concepts behind peacekeeping. So he suggested the concept of using a peacekeeping force as a means of resolving conflicts between states. Now, those words between states is fairly significant for the history of peacekeeping, at least in the first few decades of its history. During the Cold War especially, peacekeeping was usually used when two different countries were at war with each other or conflicting. And so peacekeepers were meant to try to stop these conflicts, or when there was like a ceasefire, they tried to turn it into a more peaceful scenario. So Lester B. Pearson here, he actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for this in 1957. So when he addressed the UN General Assembly in the midst of the Suez Crisis, Pearson made his case for a peace and police force, saying peace is far more than ceasing to fire. Now, what he means by more than ceasing to fire is that just because two sides stop shooting at each other does not mean that you are going to have 2 decades of peace and cooperation following this. And so the role of peacekeepers is very, what's the word I'm looking for? It has a whole bunch of different ways they go about doing it. So peacekeeping refers to the deployment of international personnel to help maintain peace and security in the aftermath of war. So it's an international force, and they usually come in after a war has stopped or paused. One of the issues, though, with this that you might already pick up is that when troops are entering another country, you're dealing with the issue of sovereignty. And it means you have to kind of give up a bit of your sovereignty to have a peacekeeping force come in. So it's fairly complicated. Now, all peacekeeping missions involve military personnel, though they may or may not be armed. Many of these missions include substantial civilian components as well. Now, this is because it has so many different aspects to what they're doing. Not everything is about making sure people aren't shooting at each other. Some of this is things like making sure an election is run fairly. And so that's why we see civilian components. Now, in practice, it's been a multilateral activity. Multilateral meaning carried out by a group such as the UN, which is made up of 193 countries, or other regional organizations. So sometimes the United Nations will approve a peacekeeping force from another organization. Now, the multilateral nature of peacekeeping helps to ensure its impartiality and to bolster its legitimacy in the eyes of the peace kept and the international community. A couple words here let's talk about. So impartiality. If I am impartial to something, I don't have a preconceived idea or I don't have a bias. Peacekeepers are not going in with a mission to, let's say, overthrow a government or put one specific side of the conflict in power. They're trying to be impartial and allow the peace process to be done between the two groups, or more than two groups sometimes. And then peace kept is just a term that's used to describe the people within a country that peacekeeping forces are working in. There's two different types of peacekeeping missions. Well, there's four types, so pardon me there. However, they fall under two different kind of branches called Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 missions. Now, the United Nations Charter doesn't actually refer to the concept of peacekeeping. That's kind of an interesting thing here, right? So it's actually an improvisation following between the actions envisioned by the Charter in Chapter 6, Pacific settlement of disputes, and those in Chapter 7, use of force against threats to peace. And so the first three types of peacekeeping missions fall under Chapter 6. These are consent-based, while the fourth goes under the Chapter 7 mission. Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, he described peacekeeping as Chapter 6.5. So falling somewhere in between. So again, four types. The first three fall under Chapter 6. The fourth falls under Chapter 7. Noticing that the first three are called consent-based, you should have an understanding of the word consent. If somebody says no, you do not have consent. Therefore, if you have consent, you have been told you can use the peacekeeping force. Let's look at some of the different types of peacekeeping missions. The first one is called an observation mission. So a smaller deployment, you have military, sometimes civilians. They're acting as observers to monitor a ceasefire or the withdrawal of troops or other terms of an agreement, such as elections. These are often unarmed because their main tasks are to watch and report what they see. If an observation mission is in place, again, their role is not to fight different combatants. Their goal is to observe and report. Can that mission change? Yes. However, observation is not really a military force. Next, we have interpositional missions. So these are larger deployments of lightly armed troops. So they're meant to monitor and report on compliance with an agreement, but sometimes they're working what we would call a buffer zone to separate forces or help demobilize and disarm military factions. So if you have two different groups fighting each other, maybe it's a government and a rebel group, they create what's called a buffer zone. So this would be a spot where the two are not supposed to be fighting. So they're trying to separate the forces here. And then from there, maybe doing things like getting rid of weapons or making sure that they actually are working together to figure out the problem. The next type is multidimensional. So here again, it's military and civilian. So in addition to roles played by observation and interpositional missions, they also perform a variety of tasks. So maybe something such as organizing elections or human rights training and monitoring, police reform, institution building, economic development, and so on. Now, each one of those aspects is significant, and we could talk about it for a long time. But one thing to kind of just keep in mind is that peace itself is a fairly complicated issue, right? If you were to ask, well, why is Canada a peaceful country? We'd have to look into a lot of these different things, right? Canada has free and democratic elections. There's also checks and balances in Canada to make sure that people's rights are being kept, they're not being violated. We have a police force that isn't corrupt, and so they also have laws they follow. They are accountable for their actions. We have institutions, our economy is developed. So there's lots of different aspects to peace. Peace does not just mean people aren't shooting each other. There's more to it. And these types of missions can only operate with the consent of the belligerents. So the country that is taking peacekeepers in must give them permission. Next, we have peace enforcement missions. So this would be our chapter 7. Now, they involve substantial military forces to provide security and ensure compliance with the ceasefire. Now, these missions have a mandate to use force for purposes in addition to self-defense. One of the things people often talk about with peacekeeping is that, and especially with those chapter 6 missions, a peacekeeper does not go in and have permission to shoot at people. Essentially, they say, unless you are being shot at. This can be very controversial because it means you may just have to stand by and watch as a civilian is being targeted, but if you yourself are not being targeted, you cannot fire. So here in the peace enforcement missions, they actually are mandated to use force in addition to self-defense. Some of these are also multidimensional, so they would be using aspects of the other 3. And most of them enjoy the consent of the belligerents, at least at the beginning of the mission. The difference, though, is unlike Chapter 6 missions, if they lose that consent, they don't have to leave. Whereas in a Chapter 6 mission, if all of a sudden the country decides, you know what, we don't want you intermingling in our affairs anymore, well, they have to leave. So peacekeepers assist host countries in navigating the path from conflict to peace. They're guided by 3 basic principles: consent of the parties, impartiality, and non-use of force, except in self-defense and defense of the mandate. So we've talked a little bit about what they do. Here's a few ways that peacekeepers can disrupt potential pathways back to war. Again, one thing that's always important to be thinking about here is it's not just about keeping people from shooting at each other. It's about creating a new environment that will sustain peace. So the first way they do this, change the incentives for war and peace. Why are people going to war in the first place? Is a rebel group trying to gain power? Or do they feel that their maybe group is not being represented in the government? So if you can change that, you can change some of those incentives. Maybe something like a group is using conflict resources to fund what they're doing and gain wealth. So if you can change maybe the demand or access to these conflict resources, you can change those incentives. Number 2, reducing their uncertainty about each other's intentions. One of the problems with conflict, especially in these scenarios, is that 2 groups may not be able to know what they're doing or what they want. So a peacekeeper can work as an arbitrator and actually give both sides clear information. Right? If 2 people are getting into a fight, they're going to have a hard time understanding maybe what they want, what their intentions are. So somebody comes in and now they mediate between the 2 of them. Number 3, preventing and controlling accidents or skirmishes that may otherwise lead to war. In these hostile environments, it's very tense and it doesn't take much to escalate a conflict again. They call that a tripwire. Maybe somebody accidentally shoots somebody else, but now this turns into a whole nother 3-year war. Peacekeepers can try to take some of these accidents and diffuse the situation. So instead of it escalating into something huge again, they can be there to mediate between the 2 sides and de-escalate. And then number 4, preventing either side from permanently excluding others from the political process. Again, a lot of this has to do with representation in government. And so they try to make sure that nobody's excluded. Now, here's a little chart showing some of the mechanisms of peacekeeping. So if we're talking about changing the incentives for war or peace, you have things like providing military deterrence, monitoring to make surprise attack more difficult, provide a tripwire for enforcement missions, So if they need to, they can then change into an enforcement one. They can have aid being recognized that they have to comply with the rules, otherwise they do not get like foreign aid. They can influence domestic public opinion, and they can also provide peace dividends, so jobs, public works, direct payoff, etc. Reducing uncertainty and fear, so they can monitor compliance, facilitate communication, and allow peace kept to signal intentions for peace. Preventing and controlling accidents. Here they can deter rogue groups, shift power toward moderates, ease the communication between groups, provide on-the-spot mediation, provide law and order, or provide alternative to escalation in response to alleged violations. And then preventing political abuse. So monitoring and or training security sectors. So army, police, monitoring or running election processes, providing neutral interim administration, transforming military groups into political organizations. So sometimes people that were combatants against a government are actually trained. Sometimes they're put into the government army, sometimes they're given government positions, because this then integrates and creates a scenario where peace is more likely to last. Now, Canada's role as peacekeepers. In the 60s, Canadians saw peacekeeping as a national vocation and burden.
Mrs. Hamilton, you're requested at your office.
Gotta love interruptions. Now, Canadians, they contributed to missions in the Republic of the Congo, West Papua New Guinea, Yemen, Cyprus. And Canadians were so important to peacekeeping that between 48 and 88, they contributed 10% of all UN peacekeeping forces. That's a huge number. 10%. Canada's not that big of a country. So it goes to show how symbolic peacekeeping was in Canada. Here's a few famous images of Canadians. On the left, that's Romeo Dallaire. He was the leader of the mission in Rwanda. Now, I believe the number here I have is out of date now, but to show some of the change, again, at one point, Canadians were 10% of youth peacekeeping forces. In the last couple of years, they've only been about 179. Drastic change. So why has that change happened? Well, there was a bit of a decline in peacekeeping, or at least the way it was viewed worldwide. In the 90s, there were several high-profile failures that saw a decrease in the role of peacekeeping and a decrease in the commitment from Canadian and American personnel. In Somalia, 20 peacekeepers were killed, including 18 Americans. This is shown in the film Black Hawk Down. In Bosnia, there wasn't any peace to keep between warring groups. UN mission had a hard time achieving their mandate. 167 UN fatalities. Or Rwanda. This is something you guys are all familiar with. The UN peacekeepers that were there failed to stop a genocide of more than 800,000 people. So demonstrating their inability to act in drastic situations. Now, the Rwanda one is a little tricky because they weren't there to be combatants at first, so the mission should have changed. But peacekeeping has changed in general. During the Cold War, it was primarily an interstate conflict, so again, between two different countries or nation states. In the few cases of peacekeeping in civil wars prior to 89, the primary purpose was less to prevent the resumption of war than to contain and prevent superpower intervention. So trying to stop the US or Russia or Soviet Union from intervening. Now, since 1989, the number, size, and scope of missions deployed in the aftermath of civil wars has exploded. And there's been both successful and unsuccessful peacekeeping missions. But these are some important statistics to look at here, especially when people have negative connotations towards something like peacekeeping. So conservative estimates indicate that peacekeeping reduces the risk of another war by more than half. That's significant. It's saying if you are potentially going to go back to war, having peacekeepers there is going to decrease that by 50%. Less conservative estimates show that it cuts the risk of renewed war by 75 to 85%. In my personal opinion, that's a huge success rate. There's also been a lot of interesting research into whether or not peacekeeping missions go to difficult scenarios or easy, and they actually tend to go to more difficult situations and crises. So I think any conflicts being stopped means it's successful. But yes, there are some failures that happen as well. The Battle of Medak Pocket, this is just one example of Canadians in peacekeeping. Now, this was Canada's largest military engagement since the Korean War. That's changed now with Canada's role in Afghanistan. But Canada had contributed a battalion to the UN PROFOR with the intent of enforcing a peace settlement in Croatia. This was a more dangerous role, and so Canada's blue helmeted soldiers need to be more heavily armed than traditional peacekeeping operations. We end up having a firefight between the Croats and Canadians. As many as 27 Croats were killed, 4 Canadians wounded. So this again was the heaviest fighting the Canadian Army had experienced since the Korean War. Now, one quick side note on the blue helmets. They were created in the early stages of the UN because there needed to be something to distinguish peacekeepers from regular soldiers. They wanted, if a sniper was looking from a far distance, they wanted them to be able to see that a blue helmet was present, meaning, oh, this is not my enemy. This is an impartial bystander. So we have a little bit of an outdated slide here. My apologies. As of November 2018, there were 14 peacekeeping operations, but over 100,000 personnel serving in them. 124 countries contributing. There's been 71 operations since 1948, so there's been a lot. The budget for this 1 year, $6.69 billion. So quite a bit, but again, what they're doing is significant. Since 1948, there's been 3,780 fatalities. Potentially that needs to be updated, but because one of the more recent missions in Mali was quite dangerous. Here's a graph showing you the spike and changes in fatalities based on years. Now, peacemaking, this is different. So this is an active military operation used to achieve peace, similar to the Chapter 7 missions. But here we see different types of tactics, airstrikes, ground military forces, greater focus on training troops for combat. In more recent years, Canada has switched focus from peacekeeping to peacemaking with different current military operations. Now, this though comes with a cost. If we look at these two different numbers here, so all of Canada's peacekeeping efforts and the history of Canadian peacekeeping, only 130 were killed. Yet with peacemaking, since 2002 in Afghanistan, 159 Canadians were killed. Greatest amount of casualties for Canadians in war since the Korean War. So Canada has changed their role in the international stage, and they're not participating as much in traditional peacekeeping operations as they are in things like the war in Afghanistan or combating ISIS. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it brought some clarity. Again, peacekeeping is complicated. It's multifaceted. It has had quite an astounding success rate when you really think about how many conflicts it stopped from occurring. But yes, it has also had some drastic failures. Anyway, you'll learn more about this doing some research. I hope you enjoyed it.